This month marks the 3-year anniversary of the most embarrassing moment in the history of our country. Kamala and Crooked Joe's catastrophic withdrawal from Afghanistan has just been horrible for all of us. 3 years ago, Kamala and Biden's incompetence left 13 dead warriors, hundreds of civilians killed and grievously wounded, and $85 billion worth of the finest military equipment on the planet abandoned to the Taliban, right into the hands of the Taliban.
All right, I'm going to play more of that for you in just a second here, a video that Trump posted. And a lot of the talking points you're hearing is something that a lot of you have asked me to address a little bit more comprehensively, because we hear so often about the Afghanistan withdrawal, MAGA talking points. And many of them are very dishonest. And what upsets me a lot, I'll talk about this more, is what they're being dishonest about, given the magnitude of that subject, the importance, the severity of the subject. So I'm going to bring in someone, a guest, who is very knowledgeable about this and will catch Trump in the act of misleading people after you watch this full video. So here's the rest of it, then we'll break it down.
It also left 45 incredible soldiers so badly wounded, the legs, the arms, the face, obliteration. As Vice President, Kamala bragged that she was the last person in the room. She was the tough one. She was the last person in the room during that disastrous withdrawal from Afghanistan decision. She repeatedly praised the decisions, and she said it led to a catastrophe, but it was worth it. The incompetence and weakness on display from the Biden-Harris administration was an insult to every soldier, sailor, airman, and Marine who ever served in our U.S. military. As we mark this horrible occasion, we mourn with the families of the great American heroes who lost their lives 3 years ago, and we vow to never forget the supreme sacrifice they made for our country. America cannot afford 4 more years of Kamala Harris in the White House. She is a disaster. She's a radical Marxist. She destroyed San Francisco. She destroyed the state of California. Everything in her way she destroyed.
And I want to bring in now Josiah, host of Pondering Politics on YouTube. Great to be with you, Josiah. So I've talked with you before, I think on the show and off the show, about this topic. And you're very knowledgeable about it, which is why I wanted to bring you in on this subject. Going through, and because of how many of the premises that a lot of these arguments about the withdrawal from Afghanistan are built on, so many of those are embedded now into our day-to-day political discussions that unraveling the dishonesty of what Trump is saying there actually takes some effort. And so first I want to say up front, before throwing it over to you, that what upsets me so much about this is that it's Trump and MAGA exploiting what was a very, very disastrous, tragic set of circumstances. And our discussion now, debunking some of the things he's saying, doesn't take away from the loss of life and how tragic that is, the service of those individuals, etc. But it's important, given how important that subject is, that we inject truth into the conversation. So with that being said, let's start. You can kind of go in whatever order you want, Josiah, but from what you heard there, starting with the equipment in Afghanistan talking point, he says $85 billion Biden just handed over to the Taliban in equipment. What do you say to that?
Yeah, so first and foremost, estimates vary about the equipment left behind. You also have to parse through what exactly he's talking about. The problem with Trump and MAGA Republicans is that they're never specific, okay? Certainly not with their criticisms of the Biden-Harris administration. It makes it easier to exaggerate and to, when called out on it, dissemble and engage in revisionist history. So you have to remember that the Afghanistan war was the longest war in American history, and it spanned 2 Republican administrations. It started under President Bush, continued under 2 terms of President Obama, and then under Donald Trump, and then it concluded under President Biden. So 2 sets of partisan administrations. And every administration gave the Afghan government and sold the Afghan government collectively billions of dollars of equipment, okay? That equipment was no longer ours. So first and foremost, there's that. You have to parse through what we sold to them, what we loaned to them, and what was actually ours for the U.S. troops that were still stationed in Afghanistan. That did belong to us. During the withdrawal, the Defense Department either took all the equipment that was ours, not that we gave or sold to the Afghan government. What was ours? We either took it back with us, or the equipment that we couldn't get back, we scuttled. We rendered it inoperable, number one. Number two, what makes this really infuriating is that when Donald Trump made the deal with the Taliban, which I'm sure we'll get into, setting up the Afghanistan withdrawal, at the same time that year, 2020, the Department of Justice did an audit of the equipment, the United States equipment that was in Afghanistan that belonged to us or that we gave or sold to the Afghan government. And that report concluded that they hadn't tracked everything, that there was equipment that we didn't know where it was. We had no idea where it was. That was under the Trump administration. So think about this, Luke. Donald Trump wants you to believe that basically he had everything wrapped up in a bow. He knew where every helicopter, gun, grenade was. And Joe Biden came in and just ruined it all. When in fact, the Trump-era DOD did an audit and they're like, hey, we have no idea where a lot of this equipment is. Trump had a year, Luke, to correct that mistake. And he chose not to. And as per usual, he left the next guy to hold the bag.
Yeah, I was looking into that figure, and it's something like not even close to accurate. Something like they just added up a bunch of totals of money we spent on equipment and said, that's what we left. And to your point, right, not accurate. And then if we were to have an accurate conversation about what money, a much smaller number in equipment is in Afghanistan that maybe the Taliban could get their hands on, that is something you can actually use, it would be stuff that the Afghan government, like you mentioned, was given. So then my question to those pretending like this was some incorrect decision by Biden and Harris, are you saying we should have taken away from the Afghan government all ability to defend themselves when we pulled out? That doesn't make any sense, does it? So well said there, Josiah. The next part of it is do talk about, because I've seen some conversation about this, but just to put it succinctly, I do want to go down the path of talking about how Biden was left sort of in a corner with the decisions he had because of the deal that was struck by Trump, how that carried over. But also I want to say as another just caveat, I think we should have pulled out of Afghanistan. And so the fact that Biden ended up doing that, I do think that was the right decision. I'm sure better decisions could have been made. Anytime tragedy happens, you have to look at where you could have improved. But I want people to know, if we do criticize or talk about how there's this intertwined nature of the Trump leaving office with a plan and not actually following through completely on it, and then Biden having to pick up from there, it's not because I generally don't think we should have pulled out of Afghanistan. So with that being said, what's the connection there, Josiah?
So, yeah, Luke, I mean, and I'll also say that the poll said that a majority of Americans wanted to get out of Afghanistan as well. And for years, it was nothing new. So you're certainly not alone there. Of course, the question comes down to details. And what you hear from Donald Trump and bad faith MAGA Republicans are a couple of things. The first of which is, okay, let's say that Donald Trump made a bad deal, but he was no longer president. Joe Biden's president. That means he could have shredded the Doha deal that Trump made with the Taliban. And legally speaking, that is true. The president could have just disregarded Donald Trump's deal. The problem is there's no cosmic reset. This is not a video game. You don't revert to last save. There's the other person in this deal, the Taliban. If President Biden had stepped into office and said, hey, Taliban, we're actually not going to honor the deal that the U.S. government made with you under Donald Trump. We're going to do something else. The Taliban would have started shooting U.S. troops. And that is not my opinion. That's the opinion of military experts, including the Trump-appointed chief of staff, Mark Milley, who said that was the reason that Biden was effectively hamstrung, because if he tried to renegotiate the deal, the one condition that the Taliban honored of the Trump deal, which is that they didn't shoot U.S. troops, that would be off the table. Then what would have happened? Imagine that the Taliban started attacking U.S. troops. President Biden would have effectively had to re-invade the country. Then what would have those MAGA Republicans have said? They would be complaining about that as well. So that's the first thing. The second thing is Trump also says, you know, if I had been given a second term, we would have departed with dignity and grace, and sophistication would have been smooth. There's no evidence of that. There's no evidence of that. And also consider, if that's the case, Luke, why didn't they withdraw during the 4 years that Trump was in office? And when you also consider that it was President Biden who inherited the circumstances left for him by Donald Trump, what makes us think that Trump would have, at best, basically replicated the Biden withdrawal? There's no evidence for that, if you understand what I'm saying. Like, yep. Biden inherited Trump's deal. How could Trump have better managed the disastrous deal that he negotiated than Biden? None of it makes
shown
sense.
By when Trump's asked, he gives nothing. It's just, it would have been perfect. Everything would have been great. If he actually could point to, here's exactly the specific things that Biden could have done differently operationally, then you'd have a different conversation. It reminds me of him saying Russia's invasion of Ukraine never would have happened. Oh, okay, so what would you have done differently than Biden? It would have never happened.
It just wouldn't have happened. Can I just say, Luke, you make an interesting point. So the one thing that Trump says that he'll reference when he talks about a counterfactual he would have done different is Bagram Air Base. So Bagram Air Base was a major fortification located, I think it was between 30 to 45 minutes away from Kabul, which is the major population center in Afghanistan, the capital. And so he says, under my administration, we would have kept Bagram Air Base. We would have kept it fortified. But here's the problem, Luke. That wasn't possible given the number of U.S. troops left behind by Trump. So the frustrating thing is Trump is playing armchair quarterback. He's saying, listen, this thing you did, I would have done it differently. But that wasn't possible given the circumstances that Trump left for Biden. So how would he would have had to send troops back into Afghanistan? And you mentioned, when you turned it over to me just a few minutes ago that, you support the withdrawal from Afghanistan, but that doesn't mean that we can't question the decisions made. And I totally agree with you. The Bagram Air Base is one of those decisions. People in hindsight say maybe we should have just surged U.S. troops and kept it and evacuated from Bagram rather than Kabul, which was the capital. But the logic behind abandoning Bagram made sense. It's like one of those things, it's a sound decision, even if in hindsight you can say it was the wrong decision. It made sense why you did the wrong thing. The argument was we didn't have the manpower to hold this base, so we might as well give it up and evacuate from where the people are, which was Kabul, rather than try to transport them across, 30 to 45 minutes away to an air base that we couldn't sustain. Do you understand what I'm saying? Like, even the mistakes made by the Biden administration, which were there, were made based on sound reason, even if in hindsight we can say it was a mistake.
Before getting to the next thing, it's something I've been coming back to a lot on the show recently, Josiah, which is that there's these conversations that if you could take away the insane screaming partisanship from some folks and the motive that says attack my political opponent as the top priority, facts come after that, we'll figure out how to push the facts around that narrative. And if you didn't have that, then there's all this time we could be spending on thoughtful, level-headed discussions, like, given how much of a debacle the withdrawal was, what should we learn from that? What went wrong? And then smart people can disagree about what the better option would have been, but we can engage in a thoughtful dialogue. But instead, it just becomes, almost purposefully, the Biden administration did this and this and this, and then people lie. The figures he's giving about military equipment, all that stuff, and it becomes so meaningless and either oversimplified or just completely distorted, and the level-headed conversations can't happen. One other talking point I saw you rip into somebody on social media for is, and you'll hear this a lot, under Biden, these 13 soldiers died during that process of the withdrawal. Heartbreaking. Under Trump, soldiers didn't die. Go Trump. What's your response to that?
It's just a lie. It's just a categorical lie. And listen, again, what's interesting about it is, here you and I sit as defenders of President Biden's record. We supported him when he was the Democratic nominee. We are proud and unapologetic Democrats. But even in this conversation, we've acknowledged that mistakes were made and that the withdrawal wasn't perfect. And this is a good example, just really to acknowledge 13 U.S. troops died on President Biden's watch. And as President Biden himself has acknowledged in the aftermath of that back in 2021, as the commander-in-chief, he bears command responsibility for that. The buck does stop with him. The problem is that by that same metric, if the insinuation which so many Republicans make is because U.S. troops died on Biden's watch, he is unfit to be president. Well, this is a grim statistic, but it's true, and this is what Republicans say that they measure in terms of fitness. More people died in Afghanistan, more U.S. troops died in Afghanistan under the Trump administration than the Biden administration. 65 U.S. troops died in combat in Afghanistan, which is more than 13. So if we want to have this unnuanced black and white people died on your watch, you're despicable, how dare you, then objectively, by that metric, Donald Trump is less fit for office than President Biden and Vice President Harris. And anyone who suggests otherwise is being dishonest and unprincipled in their standard.
You know, the way you worded that was just absolutely perfect, and tapping into what irritates me so much about this, because it's almost like to debunk a lie, if the lie lives in a really gross, nasty place, then to go get to it and debunk it forces you to go travel into that gross, nasty place. Because I agree, I sort of feel weird every time I point out, okay, we're talking about people, U.S. soldiers dying under one president or another. We can go through that comparison. It's not beneficial to your argument, MAGA, but I don't think that's the way we talk about things. That's way oversimplified, way grim, way missing context, all of it. But a part of what, so that, I'm happy that you pointed that out, because it's something I feel every time we point to that stat. But I think the more thoughtful point that should go along with it is that exact stat, that comparison is why it was so important to get out of Afghanistan. And so many presidents, including apparently Trump, weren't courageous enough to take the political damage that was going to come of, we didn't know exactly what it would be, but some sort of debacle as we ended America's longest war, to actually follow through. And that's something, with the criticisms that are fair about Biden, the Biden administration, the handling of that moment, that's something he should get credit for, being willing to say, I'm going to take political damage. They knew. That's part of why presidents were grappling with it so much, and he did it. Final thoughts, Josiah?
Well, I was just going to say, to your point, that was the beginning of the end of President Biden's popularity and approval rating. I mean, people forget he came into office as a relatively popular president with an approval rating in the aggregate of in the mid to upper 50s. Donald Trump, by the way, he is desperate to wish that he had an approval rating that high. He's never had an approval rating that high in office around. But Biden made a politically costly decision that was ultimately the right one, which was ending America's longest war, which resulted in the deaths of thousands of U.S. troops and countless civilians, and billions upon billions of dollars. And Trump promised for 4 years that he would make it happen, and he had 4 years to make it happen. So when people say, well, he didn't have enough time, that's nonsense. He had 3 years before he signed the Doha agreement in February 2020 to make that happen, and he chose not to because he, like the presidents before him, recognized that this would be a costly decision. And quite frankly, Luke, the last thing I'll say is there was a clip of H.R. McMaster, Donald Trump's national security advisor, his first one. He was interviewed on CNN just yesterday, and he admitted, when point blank asked by Anderson Cooper, that Donald Trump does bear responsibility, at least in part, for the withdrawal from Afghanistan and the chaos which ensued.
But Trump had his hand on, does Trump bear part of the responsibility for what happened?
Oh, yes. So the whole premise of talking to the Taliban before you leave Afghanistan, why the heck were we even doing that?
He was going to invite them to Camp David.
Right. Even the Obama administration, when they made the mistake of pulling all of our troops out of Iraq in 2010, which really set conditions for the rise of ISIS and so forth by 2014, the Obama administration didn't negotiate with al-Qaeda in Iraq on the way out. And so if we were going to leave, why not just leave? What happened in these series of negotiations and concessions to the Taliban is we kind of threw the Afghans under the bus on the way out.
So all I'm going to say is you don't even have to take my word for it or Luke's word for it. You can take former Trump officials explicitly saying in public, John Bolton's another Trump national security advisor, said the same thing. Donald Trump made the deal. Donald Trump set the stage. And to the extent that the withdrawal was chaotic, Donald Trump also bears responsibility.
Josiah, thank you so much for joining. You've been very informative. Where can people find your work?
I appreciate it, Luke. It's always good to cooperate and collaborate with you. And people can find me at youtube.com/@ponderingpolitics, one word.